The most dangerous weapon ever aimed at a carrier strike group has never been a missile. It has never been a torpedo, a drone, or a hypersonic glide vehicle. The most dangerous weapon ever aimed at a carrier strike group is a piece of paper, a manifest, a certification document, a quality control form that says something is safe when it is not, signed by someone whose credentials are genuine and whose allegiance is not. The paper that came closest to destroying $12 billion of American naval hardware and the 4,700 lives aboard the USS Carrier in the Arabian Sea arrived not on a hostile frequency or a radar track. It arrived on a fuel barge. It arrived in the dark at 1:15 a.m. through the standard aviation fuel replenishment procedure that carrier strike groups conduct dozens of times per deployment. It arrived with all the correct documentation, all the correct seals, all the correct certifications, and a chemical composition that would have, had it reached the aircraft, produced engine flameouts in every fixed-wing aircraft that attempted to launch from the flight deck at the precise moment that 47 ballistic missiles and 61 cruise missiles entered the strike group's engagement envelope from 3 separate axes. The timing was not coincidental. Nothing about what followed was coincidental. It had been planned for 14 months. The aviation fuel supply chain for Fifth Fleet operations in the Arabian Sea runs through a commercial fuel logistics contractor operating out of a facility in Fujairah, United Arab Emirates. The contractor had held the Fifth Fleet fuel supply contract for 7 years. Its quality control certifications had been audited 4 times and had returned satisfactory results on each occasion. Its ownership structure, a holding company registered in the UAE with subsidiary operations in 3 countries, had been vetted during the initial contract award and reviewed at each renewal. The vetting had found nothing of concern. What the vetting had not found, what no vetting process had been designed to find, because the penetration had been built specifically to defeat the standard contractor security review, was that the holding company's majority ownership had changed hands 18 months earlier through a series of nominee transactions that had been structured to be invisible to standard commercial registry searches. The beneficial ownership, after the transfer, traced through 4 intermediate entities to a commercial investment vehicle registered in Cyprus, whose ultimate controlling interest was held by a natural person whose financial and biographical profile had been constructed over a period of 9 years through the patient accumulation of genuine business activities, genuine tax filings, genuine professional relationships, and genuine commercial transactions, all of it real, all of it documented, all of it creating the appearance of a successful regional entrepreneur whose only anomalous characteristic was that he had been an Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security asset since the age of 26. The asset had not been activated in any operationally significant way for 7 years. His function had been to exist, to build the cover, to accumulate the credentials, to position the holding company in the commercial environment of Gulf aviation fuel logistics in a way that would eventually, when the activation came, give him access to something that a conventional intelligence operation could not reach. Patience was the weapon. The 7 years were the weapon. The activation, when it came 14 months before this night, had been gradual enough that nothing about his behavior had changed in any way that a monitoring system would have flagged. The contamination agent was not a crude toxin or a gross adulterant. It was a synthetic compound developed in an Iranian military chemistry program over a period of 4 years. A substance that was chemically stable, that would pass the standard quality control tests applied to aviation fuel at the point of delivery, that was visually and olfactorily indistinguishable from JP-5 naval aviation fuel, and that would remain inert through the standard delivery and storage process until it encountered the specific temperature and pressure conditions present in an operational aircraft engine at high power settings. At those conditions, the compound would catalyze a carbon deposit reaction in the fuel injector system that would produce a progressive loss of fuel flow within 60 to 90 seconds of maximum power application. precisely the power setting required for a catapult launch from a carrier flight deck. An aircraft losing fuel flow on a carrier catapult stroke does not have recovery options. It does not have altitude. It does not have airspeed. It has the flight deck in front of it and the ocean below it. And it has the pilots who are already committed to a launch from which there is no abort once the catapult fires. The contaminated fuel had been introduced into the standard delivery batch during a blending operation at the Fujairah facility at 10:30 p.m., 3 days before the replenishment. The introduction was conducted by a single technician who had been employed at the facility for 2 years, who held all required certifications, and who had been recruited through a financial approach 18 months earlier. An approach so gradual and so carefully calibrated to the specific financial pressures in the technician's personal situation that the technician had understood the full implications of what he was being recruited for. Only after he was already committed far enough that the path back looked more dangerous than the path forward. The contamination was introduced in a quantity precisely calculated to produce a compound concentration in the final delivered product that would fall below the detection threshold of the quality control tests applied at the point of delivery, while being sufficient to produce the catalytic reaction in an operational engine. The fuel barge carrying the contaminated product arrived at the carrier's fuel reception point at 1:15 a.m. The delivery was logged, the documentation checked, the seal integrity verified. The fuel's petty officer on watch conducted the standard acceptance sampling procedure, drawing fuel from 3 separate delivery points on the barge for quality control testing. The tests checked for water content, particulate contamination, flash point, and specific gravity. The synthetic compound affected none of these parameters at the concentration present in the delivery. The tests returned satisfactory results. The transfer was authorized. By 2:47 a.m., 14,000 gallons of contaminated JP5 had entered the carrier's aviation fuel storage system and been distributed through the standard fuel management cycle to the aircraft service stations on the hangar deck and the flight deck island fuel points. The aircraft scheduled for the morning's first launch cycle had been fueled beginning at 3 a.m. By 4:15 a.m., 9 FA, 18 Super Hornets, 2 EA, 18G Growlers, and 1 E-2D Advanced Hawkeye had been fueled and positioned for the 5:30 a.m. launch. At 4:52 a.m., a quality assurance officer in the carrier's aviation department was completing his pre-launch inspection checklist in the hangar bay. The QA inspection was a routine function, verifying the maintenance status of the aircraft, confirming that all pre-flight sign-offs were complete, and checking the fuel sampling records for the aircraft in the morning's launch package. The QA officer had been performing this function for 3 years. He had a pattern of thoroughness that his department head had noted twice in his fitness reports as an exceptional professional attribute. On this morning, his thoroughness took him to the fuel sampling log for the aircraft fueled from the flight deck island fuel point at 3:47 a.m., a point that was at the end of the distribution run from the received delivery. He noticed that the sampling log entry for that fuel point showed a specific gravity reading that was 2/1000ths of a point lower than the reading recorded for the same aircraft type fueled from the hangar deck service stations 2 hours earlier. The difference was within the specification tolerance. It was not a failed reading. It was a past reading that was different from another past reading in a way that was small enough to be routine and specific enough to someone who had been looking at these numbers for 3 years to be worth a question. He filed a discrepancy query at 4:58 a.m. Not a grounding order, not a maintenance hold. A query, a request for a retest of the fuel from the island point to confirm whether the reading was stable. The retest was conducted at 5:04 a.m. The result was the same. The QA officer escalated to the aviation fuels officer at 5:07 a.m. The aviation fuels officer pulled the full delivery record, the barge documentation, and the acceptance test results, while the QA officer was still on the phone. He had the complete picture in front of him at 5:11 a.m. Everything in the record was correct. Every test had passed. Every seal had been intact. But the specific gravity differential between the island point and the hangar deck service stations was reproducible and stable, which meant it was real, which meant something was different about the fuel from the island point distribution run, which was at the end of the delivery cycle, which was where any contaminant introduced at the delivery source would be most concentrated after the distribution flow pattern settled. He called the department head at 5:13 a.m. The department head had the strike group commander on the line at 5:16 a.m. Flight operations were suspended at 5:18 a.m. The launch cycle was canceled. 12 minutes before the first aircraft was scheduled to go to the catapult, at 5:19 a.m., the aviation fuels officer requested an emergency chromatographic analysis of fuel samples from 3 points in the distribution system. The analysis that the standard quality control process did not include because the equipment required was not part of the standard ship's laboratory suite. The carrier had the equipment in its environmental monitoring laboratory used for a different purpose, whose operator was located and briefed at 5:21 a.m. The first chromatographic result was available at 5:44 a.m. The result identified a compound that was not JP5. It was not any compound in the standard aviation fuel contaminant library. The environmental monitoring laboratory operator had never seen its spectral signature. She photographed it, logged it, and transmitted it to the Fifth Fleet scientific advisor ashore at 5:49 a.m. with a message that read, in its entirety, unknown synthetic organic compound, concentration approximately 340 parts per million, origin unknown, requesting immediate identification assistance. The Fifth Fleet scientific advisor had the spectral signature in front of a chemical weapons defense analyst at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency within 11 minutes. The analyst had never seen the specific compound, but she recognized its structural family, a class of synthetic fuel system catalysts whose development had been documented in an Iranian military chemistry research program assessed by the intelligence community 3 years earlier. The assessment had concluded that the program was in an early development phase and was unlikely to produce an operationally viable product for several years. The assessment had been distributed. It had been read. It had been filed. It had been wrong by approximately 2 years. She transmitted her assessment at 6:07 a.m., high confidence that the compound was derived from an Iranian military chemistry development program. Probable operational intent, aviation engine degradation under high power conditions. Recommend immediate fuel system flush and complete aircraft refueling from an uncontaminated source. The fuel system flush began at 6:22 a.m. It would take 4 hours and 20 minutes to complete. At 6:31 a.m., the signals intelligence platform covering the Iranian Coastal Defense Network detected a burst transmission on the IRGC Navy command frequency that the automated analysis system flagged as consistent with a strike coordination message. The content could not be immediately decrypted, but the transmission partner analysis, the mapping of which nodes in the Iranian command network were active on the same frequency cluster within the same 30-minute window, included the ballistic missile command element assessed as controlling the mobile launcher force on the coast of Hormuzgan province, the cruise missile coordination node associated with the IRGC Air Force anti-ship battery on the southern coast, and a maritime coordination frequency used by the fast attack boat flotilla based at Bandar Abbas. At 6:38 a.m., the threat picture crystallized. The Iranian operational plan had not been a standalone sabotage operation. The fuel contamination was phase 1 of a coordinated strike designed to disable the carrier's strike capacity at the moment a multi-axis conventional attack was executed. The attack was coming. The carrier had no aircraft in the air. Its flight deck was occupied by aircraft that had been fueled with contaminated fuel and could not safely launch until the flush was complete. The strike group was in the configuration the Iranian planners had designed it to be in, except that the Iranian planners had expected the contamination to be discovered at the moment aircraft began failing on the catapult, not 4 hours before the first launch was scheduled. The 12 minutes between the flight suspension at 5:18 a.m. and the original launch time of 5:30 a.m. were the margin between the plan working and the plan failing. 12 minutes purchased by a specific gravity reading that was 2/1000ths of a point off, noticed by a quality assurance officer at 4:52 a.m. during a routine check that he had been performing for 3 years. The strike group did not have aircraft airborne, but it had everything else. At 6:44 a.m., the strike group commander authorized the activation of the defensive posture that had been established under the standard high-threat protocol, a protocol that pre-positioned the surface combatants for a layered ballistic and cruise missile defense without requiring flight operations from the carrier to be functional. The Burke-class destroyers moved to their assigned intercept stations. The Ticonderoga-class cruiser reset its Aegis engagement geometry for the threat axis the signal's intelligence picture indicated. 2 Virginia-class submarines that had been operating in the strike group's protective screen received a data burst tasking them to active engagement posture. At 7:02 a.m., the first ballistic missile launch was detected from the Hormuzgan coast by the space-based infrared sensor network. Then 3 more in rapid succession. Then the cruise missile platforms went active. The radar signature of the anti-ship batteries acquisition systems lighting up on the passive sensor picture. The attack had launched. 47 ballistic missiles, launched in 3 waves from mobile platforms on the Iranian coast. Time to arrive at the carrier's position in a compressed terminal sequence designed to overwhelm intercept capacity. 61 cruise missiles launched from 4 separate platforms, shore-based batteries, surface vessels, and a modified cargo aircraft operating as a standoff launch platform at the edge of the engagement zone. 108 weapons total, aimed at a carrier whose aircraft were on the flight deck, unflyable, while its crew completed a fuel system flush. What the Iranian targeting architecture had been calculated against was a carrier without its point defense aircraft, without the E/A 18G Growlers that would jam the cruise missile guidance links, without the FA-18S that could intercept threats beyond the range of the surface-to-air missile envelope. The plan assumed the carrier was blind and soft at the precise moment the weapons arrived. The carrier was not blind. It was not soft. It was angry. The SM-3 Block 2A launches from the cruiser began at 7:04 a.m., targeting the ballistic missiles in their boost and mid-course phases over Iranian territory. The engagement geometry had been pre-computed and loaded since 6:44 a.m. The first wave of 12 ballistic missiles encountered 17 SM-3 intercepts in the exoatmospheric phase, 2 interceptors per threat, launched in pairs to maximize single salvo intercept probability. 14 of the first wave were removed from the engagement picture before they crossed the Strait of Hormuz. 2 completed their re-entry and were engaged by THAAD from the battery in Qatar that had been brought to active engagement authority at 6:46 a.m. The second wave of 19 ballistic missiles encountered a degraded SM-3 loadout. The first wave engagements had consumed the cruiser's outer tier magazine to 61%. The engagement sequencing shifted to a modified prioritization that allocated the remaining SM-3 rounds to the highest velocity threats and accepted that the lower velocity ballistic tracks in the second wave would be passed to the SM-6 and THAAD layers. 14 of the second wave were engaged at the outer and mid-range tiers. 5 entered the terminal phase. The 5 terminal phase ballistic threats were engaged simultaneously by SM-6 in terminal mode from 2 destroyers. The engagement was not clean. One SM-6 tracking solution lost lock during the final 3 seconds of approach when the target executed a terminal maneuver that the guidance algorithm's predictive model had underweighted. The lock was reacquired in 1.4 seconds. The intercept occurred 0.8 seconds inside the minimum safe detonation range. close enough that the warhead debris field intersected the destroyer's radar horizon and temporarily degraded the tracking picture for 11 seconds during the most critical phase of the cruise missile engagement. 11 seconds of degraded radar picture on the lead destroyer's southern tracking arc during a 61-missile cruise missile engagement. The CIWS systems on that destroyer went to fully autonomous engagement authority during the degraded window. They engaged 4 cruise missiles that entered the point defense zone in those 11 seconds without human authorization in the loop. The system was designed for exactly this condition. 3 of the 4 were stopped. The 4th was stopped at a range that the chief petty officer manning the CIWS console would later be unable to accurately describe from memory, because the number was smaller than his training had conditioned him to consider a survival margin. The detonation debris scattered across the destroyer's forward deck, shredding a satellite communications antenna and pitting the paint on the forward VLS covers. No penetration, no flooding, no personnel in the debris path. The ship remained fully combat capable. Of the 61 cruise missiles, 59 were intercepted or defeated by electronic countermeasures from the 2 Virginia-class submarines WLY. 1 acoustic countermeasure systems operating in the surface intercept mode, a capability that had been in the fleet's inventory for 4 years and had never been used in combat. It worked. The 2 missiles that reached the terminal phase against the carrier itself were engaged by the carrier's own ram systems and CIWS at ranges that put the second detonation close enough for the explosion to be heard from the hangar bay, where the fuel system flush teams were still working. Heard, not felt, not damaging. Heard. At 9:47 a.m., the fuel system flush was completed. The contaminated fuel had been purged from all storage and distribution points in the carrier's aviation fuel system. Clean fuel from the strike group's logistics vessel, which maintained its own separate storage unconnected to the contaminated delivery, was transferred and distributed. Aircraft began refueling at 9:52 a.m. The first clean fuel launch cycle was completed at 11:15 a.m. The first aircraft recovered from that cycle at 12:34 p.m. At 11:30 a.m., a joint NCIS and Defense Intelligence Agency team arrived at the fuel contractor facility in Fujairah with a UAE federal law enforcement liaison. The contamination point in the blending operation was identified by 1 p.m. The technician who had introduced the compound was located at 2:15 p.m. The investigation that followed would take 6 months to fully document. The ownership chain back to the MOIS asset in Cyprus took 4 months to reconstruct completely. At 3 p.m., the strike group commander submitted the operational report to 5th Fleet. The summary assessment read, in part, defensive architecture performed within established parameters under conditions of significant magazine depletion and 1 period of 11-second tracking degradation. No ships lost, no critical casualties. Aviation fuel system restored to full operational status. The report did not mention the specific gravity reading that had been 2/1000ths of a point off. Now the full accounting, 14,000 gallons of contaminated JP5 delivered and distributed. 12 aircraft fueled before discovery. 0 aircraft launched on contaminated fuel. 47 ballistic missiles launched in 3 waves. 41 intercepted in exoatmospheric and mid-range phases. 5 engaged in terminal phase, all removed from engagement picture. 61 cruise missiles launched from 4 platforms. 59 intercepted or defeated by electronic countermeasures. 2 engaged in carrier terminal defense. 0 ships lost. 0 critical casualties. 1 destroyed satellite communications antenna. 1 pitted VLS cover. 1 11-second radar tracking gap. 1 CIWS autonomous engagement during that gap. 1 detonation close enough to be heard in the hangar bay. 1 fuel system flush completed in 4 hours and 20 minutes. 1 specific gravity reading at 4:52 a.m. that was 2/1000ths of a point off from a reading taken 2 hours before it. The Iranian operation required 14 months of preparation, 9 years of asset development, and 4 years of chemistry research. It had come within 12 minutes of creating conditions for the most catastrophic engagement in U.S. naval history. It failed because a man who had been checking fuel logs for 3 years had developed an eye for numbers that were technically within tolerance and practically wrong. The adversary built the perfect operation against a carrier staffed by people who had made precision their professional standard. Not because they expected a specific threat, but because precision was the standard on every morning, in every log entry, regardless of whether anything was wrong. When everything is treated as though it matters, the one thing that actually matters cannot hide. The line held that morning not at the missile intercept range or the CIWS boundary. It held at 4:52 a.m. in a hangar bay over a fuel sampling log, because one man's standard of thoroughness matched exactly the precision the adversary's operation had assumed it would not find. That is the edge. That is always the edge.